When OMRAT looked at instrument selection processes for imaging outcome measurement instruments, things like an X-ray or an MRI or ultrasound, they found they had learned some lessons that were really applicable to all working groups. In this whiteboard, we'll go through the third lesson learned in our look at imaging outcome measurement instruments. That lesson is that with a few tweaks, we can make one instrument selection process work for all outcomes. Just as a reminder, the OMRAT filter instrument selection algorithm, or OFISA for short, is a stepwise decision-making process to guide the user to make a decision about the value of a given outcome measurement instrument to represent the target domain in a core outcome set. At OMRAT, we do this by gathering practical and then more statistical information on an instrument from discussions amongst our working group members and other stakeholders, our own studies, and certainly the literature. In the end, we want to know if an instrument has passed the filter. That is, do we have enough accumulated evidence to say that this instrument score would do a good job at representing the target domain in a clinical trial? And what about those first two lessons that we've been talking about already today? Where do they weave into the OFISA process? Well, these lessons will have the greatest impact on the first question, because both domain match and sources of variability will have an impact on the target domain. But along with that, once the sources of variability are identified, we will also need to look at tests for their impact. And those more numeric studies would show up in the third question. Do the numeric scores make sense? So if we look at lesson 1, that was about the importance of having a more detailed definition and have it providing that framework for that detail that we should consider for each of our domains. In lesson 1, we used the example of ultrasound as an instrument for the broad domain of inflammation and the target domain of synovitis. But in addition, we need to talk about exactly what features of the ultrasound exam would be captured with that synovitis. What are those specific elementary components of the ultrasound exam? In lesson 2, we talked about the sources of variability. And at that same first step in OFISA, we also integrate the need to identify sources of variability in our outcome measurement instrument score in the way that we are going to be using it. If there are important sources of variability, say between technicians of a machine, has there been any work done to try to quantify this and its impact? This might be work done about a level of agreement that we've chatted about between technicians looking at the same image. This would be inter-rater reliability. If we move on in OFISA, we'll see the next question is about feasibility. And the same types of questions are asked that we ask of questionnaires can be asked of imaging outcome instruments. For example, what is the cost, the timing, the training involved? What is the burden to the patient to have to be positioned, for example, and stay in one position for a very long time, or to have to travel to a special machine? We might question the practicality of training up enough technicians because of the variability between technicians that we found in getting a certain image. Patient partners clearly play a very key role in this stage of the assessment for all type of outcome measurement instruments, but also for imaging outcome instruments. And just like we would with any type of instrument, like questionnaires, if an imaging instrument does not either capture the right target domain or is not feasible to use, we can stop right there. But otherwise, we start to look for evidence, and that evidence comes in the form of measurement properties. So what evidence do we actually need? The properties here are pretty much the same as for patient-reported outcomes, with the addition of a couple of red ones here, which are the new ones. And let's look at those additions. First is reliability across those sources of variability. So if you're wondering if two raters can get the same score if they tested the same patients, you would look for and want to see high inter-rater reliability to give you confidence that you don't need to worry about which rater is doing the examination. You can do the same for comparing a measurement across different machines, if that was a concern for inter-machine reliability. With questionnaires, if there was a difference seen in scores gathered on paper questionnaires versus computer questionnaires, then we better look at inter-method reliability. So we've added this into the third OFISA question, do the numeric scores make sense? If we look to an example of this, we can go to the chapter by Alexandra Eason et al. In Measurement and Radiology Research. An example of inter-rater reliability was given. 50 MRI images were gathered by magnetic resonance imaging on the same part of the brain of the same subjects, and they were given in different orders to 2 different raters. The resultant scores were compared using an intra-class correlation coefficient, the perfect statistic for this type of comparison, to see if the raters agreed enough to allow either one of them to read the MRIs in a future study. The other measurement property that we'll be adding into OFISA is because sometimes domains in an imaging outcome can be captured by a gold standard, but perhaps that absolute truth of the target domain is too expensive or invasive to use on a regular basis. The new instrument would therefore be a substitute for that gold standard, so we better make sure it's doing a good enough job. This is a form of validity we sometimes call criterion validity, where the criterion means that we have a gold standard. For many outcomes like pain and function, we do not have a gold standard, so we talk continuously about construct validity. But in imaging outcomes, we sometimes do, like a biopsy analysis to confirm inflammation, as opposed to an ultrasound exam. And that's exactly the example again from the Eason chapter, where we can see an example comparing an imaging outcome using ultrasound to the results of a biopsy test in the very same patient. The biopsy analysis in this case was considered the gold standard, and they looked at how well the ultrasound could detect the same things that we could see in the gold standard, knowing that that was the true finding. But aside from that, and those additions, and that's important information, OFISA is a pretty good fit for making decisions about imaging outcome instruments and whether they are good choices for a core outcome set. You can expect to see the adjustments I've spoken about today in our OMRAT handbook this fall. So this is the last introductory video about the 3 lessons that we learned by digging into the instrument selection processes from an imaging outcome perspective. OMRAT would like to thank the Imaging Working Group for looking at instrument selection for these unique types of outcome instruments, to the Technical Advisory Group and the Imaging Working Group for helping us with some of these concepts, and the Patient Research Partner Imaging Task Force for co-developing these whiteboards and training tools with us.